The morning mist clung to the quiet streets of Millbrook, Oregon, like a shroud, transforming the familiar suburban landscape into something ethereal and unsettling. At exactly 6:15 a.m., just as he had done every single day for the past 15 years, Robert Bobby Mitchell stepped out of his modest two-story home on Maple Street. The 67-year-old veteran moved with the measured precision of a man whose life had been shaped by military discipline, his weathered hands adjusting the worn baseball cap that bore the faded insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division. Beside him, Mika bounded with the enthusiasm only a 5-year-old golden retriever could muster at dawn. Her tail wagged furiously as she recognized the familiar routine, her amber eyes bright with anticipation for their daily 3-mile circuit through the residential streets and into the wooded trail that bordered the town's eastern edge. Bobby smiled, the kind of gentle expression that had become more frequent since his retirement, as he clipped the red leash to Mika's collar. "Ready for another adventure, girl?" he whispered, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who had breathed too much desert sand and diesel fumes during his tours overseas. Mika responded with a playful bark, her entire body wiggling with joy. The pair set off down the sidewalk, their footsteps creating a rhythmic pattern against the damp concrete. Neighbors who happened to be early risers had grown accustomed to this daily sight. Bobby's steady gait and Mika's energetic prancing a comforting constant in their predictable suburban lives. Mrs. Henderson, watering her prize-winning roses from her front porch, waved as they passed. Bobby tipped his cap in acknowledgement, the same courteous gesture he offered every morning. Neither of them could have imagined that this simple exchange would become a crucial timestamp in what was about to unfold. As they rounded the corner onto Pine Street, heading toward the trail entrance, the morning seemed perfectly ordinary, unmarked by any sign of the chaos that would soon engulf this quiet community. But something was already wrong, though no one would realize it for hours. In the growing light of dawn, Millbrook appeared peaceful and safe, but beneath its tranquil surface, dark currents were about to surge to the surface, carrying with them secrets that some residents had spent years trying to bury. 23 minutes later, Mika came racing back down Maple Street alone, her leash dragging behind her, her golden coat matted with burrs, and her eyes wild with a terror that no animal should ever have to experience. She scratched frantically at the front door of Bobby's house, whimpering and pacing in circles, her usual joyful demeanor replaced by something that looked disturbingly like human panic. When the neighbors finally noticed her distress and Bobby's conspicuous absence, they had no way of knowing they were witnessing the beginning of a mystery that would shake their small town to its very foundation. The call came into the Millbrook Police Department at 8:47 a.m., just as Detective Sarah Thompson was settling into her desk with her third cup of coffee. Margaret Henderson's voice trembled through the phone as she explained how Mika had been crying at Bobby's door for over an hour, how the dog seemed traumatized, how Bobby never deviated from his routine and would never leave his beloved companion behind. Sarah had been working small-town cases for 12 years, mostly dealing with petty theft, domestic disputes, and the occasional drunk and disorderly. But something in Mrs. Henderson's voice made her pulse quicken with an instinct she had learned to trust. Within 30 minutes, Sarah was standing in Bobby Mitchell's meticulously maintained living room, taking notes while Mika cowered behind the sofa, refusing to come when called. The dog's behavior was unlike anything Sarah had seen in her years of police work. Golden retrievers were known for their friendly, outgoing nature, but Mika acted as though she had witnessed something unspeakable. Her ears were pinned back, her tail tucked firmly between her legs, and every few minutes she would let out a low, mournful whine that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. Bobby's house told the story of a man who lived with military precision and quiet pride. His Purple Heart sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, surrounded by photographs from his time in Afghanistan and Iraq. The kitchen counter held his usual morning routine, A coffee mug still warm to the touch, a piece of toast with one bite taken, and his medications laid out in the weekly pill organizer that spoke to the methodical nature of his daily existence. Everything suggested he had intended to return within the hour. Sarah examined the leash that Mika had dragged home, noting the fresh scratches on the metal clasp and several strands of what appeared to be fabric caught in the links. The dog's collar showed similar signs of struggle, with small tears in the leather that suggested she had pulled against something with considerable force. As Sarah documented these details, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mika was trying to communicate something crucial, something that could unlock the mystery of what had happened during those missing 23 minutes. The search began immediately, with Sarah coordinating teams of volunteers and fellow officers to canvass the route Bobby and Mika took every morning. The trail that bordered the eastern edge of town wound through dense Douglas fir and cedar, creating pockets of perpetual shadow even during daylight hours. It was here, approximately 1.5 miles from Bobby's house, that they found the first real evidence that something violent had occurred. A section of the trail showed clear signs of disturbance. The morning's light rain had turned the earth soft, preserving a confusing tangle of footprints, boot marks, and what appeared to be drag marks leading away from the main path. Sarah crouched down, studying the scene with the methodical attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected investigators in the county. There were at least 3 different sets of footprints, not including Bobby's familiar hiking boots, which were clearly visible heading toward the disturbed area, but nowhere to be found leading away from it. Most disturbing were the signs that Mika had been present during whatever had transpired. Her paw prints were scattered around the scene in frantic patterns, and several tufts of golden fur clung to the low-hanging branches nearby. A torn piece of red fabric, clearly from her leash, hung from a thorny blackberry bush about 15 feet off the main trail. The evidence painted a picture of chaos and struggle, but Bobby Mitchell himself was nowhere to be found, as if he had simply vanished into the morning mist. As news of Bobby's disappearance spread through Millbrook, Sarah began to uncover layers of complexity she hadn't expected in what initially seemed like a straightforward missing person case. Bobby Mitchell, it turned out, had been more than just a quiet retiree taking daily walks with his dog. In the months leading up to his disappearance, he had been asking questions around town, questions that made some people uncomfortable. 3 weeks before he vanished, Bobby had attended a town council meeting, standing up during the public comment period to voice concerns about a proposed development project on the eastern edge of town. The project, spearheaded by a company called Millbrook Holdings, would clear-cut a significant portion of the forest where Bobby and Mika took their daily walks, replacing the natural habitat with luxury condominiums marketed to wealthy retirees from Portland and Seattle. But Bobby's objections went deeper than simple environmental concerns. During that council meeting, he had raised questions about the bidding process, suggesting that local officials might have conflicts of interest in the project's approval. He had mentioned conducting his own research, talking about documents he had obtained through public records requests that showed irregularities in how the land had been acquired. Several attendees later described his presentation as passionate but controlled, the words of a man who had uncovered something significant and wasn't going to let it go. Sarah's investigation into Bobby's background revealed a man whose military training had instilled in him a deep sense of justice and an inability to ignore corruption when he saw it. His service record showed commendations for integrity and leadership, qualities that had apparently followed him into civilian life. Neighbors described him as someone who paid attention to details others might miss, who noticed when things didn't add up, who asked the hard questions that others were afraid to voice. The more Sarah dug into the development project, the more complicated the web became. Millbrook Holdings, she discovered, was essentially a shell company with ties to several prominent local business leaders, including town council member Richard Grayson and real estate developer Marcus Webb. The land acquisition had involved a series of complex transactions that had transferred ownership of the forest property from the county to private hands at prices well below market value. Bobby had been methodically documenting these connections, Sarah learned, when she was finally granted permission to search his home more thoroughly. Hidden in a filing cabinet in his basement office, she found folders filled with photocopied documents, handwritten notes, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic corruption involving some of Millbrook's most respected citizens. Bobby had been building a case, preparing evidence that could have exposed the entire scheme and potentially sent several people to prison. The discovery transformed the missing person case into something far more sinister. Sarah realized she was no longer looking for a lost hiker who might have suffered a medical emergency or taken a wrong turn in the woods. She was investigating the disappearance of a man who had become a threat to powerful people with much to lose. People who had both the resources and the motivation to make problems disappear permanently. As Sarah delved deeper into the conspiracy Bobby had uncovered, she found herself facing resistance from unexpected quarters. Her requests for additional resources were denied. Her interviews with key suspects were interrupted by well-connected lawyers, and she began to sense that some of her fellow officers were less than enthusiastic about pursuing certain lines of investigation. The realization that corruption might extend into her own department added another layer of complexity to an already challenging case. Meanwhile, Mika remained the key to understanding what had actually happened that morning. Sarah arranged for the dog to be examined by a veterinary behaviorist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in trauma responses in animals. Dr. Martinez's evaluation confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Mika was exhibiting classic signs of post-traumatic stress, behaviors consistent with having witnessed violence against someone she was bonded to. Dogs don't lie, Dr. Martinez explained as she observed Mika's reactions to various stimuli in her clinic. Their responses are pure, unfiltered by the complex motivations that complicate human testimony. This dog saw something terrible happen to Bobby, and her behavior is telling us exactly that. The veterinarian's assessment included recommendations for gradually exposing Mika to elements that might trigger memories of the incident, a process that could potentially help identify the perpetrators. Sarah decided to take Mika back to the trail, hoping the dog's reactions might provide additional clues. The experiment yielded unexpected results. Mika refused to approach the area where they had found the signs of struggle, instead pulling Sarah toward a different section of the trail she hadn't previously examined. Here, nearly hidden beneath a fallen log, they discovered Bobby's baseball cap, the one bearing his 82nd Airborne insignia. The cap told its own story. Forensic analysis revealed traces of blood on the fabric, blood that DNA testing confirmed belonged to Bobby Mitchell. More significantly, the pattern of blood spatter suggested he had been struck while the cap was still on his head, then removed and discarded as his attacker or attackers moved him to another location. The discovery provided the first concrete evidence that Bobby had been the victim of violence, transforming the investigation from a missing person case into a probable homicide. But even with this evidence, Sarah found herself fighting an uphill battle. The very people she suspected of being involved in Bobby's disappearance were also some of the most influential members of the community. People with connections to the mayor's office, the city council, and even the police department itself. Her investigation was being subtly but effectively undermined at every turn. Crucial evidence was mysteriously misfiled, and witnesses she needed to interview were suddenly unavailable or unwilling to talk. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after Bobby's disappearance, Sarah received an anonymous tip directing her to a storage unit on the outskirts of town. Inside, she found the rest of Bobby's research, materials he had apparently hidden as a precaution against exactly what had happened to him. The documents were even more damaging than what she had found in his house, including recorded phone conversations, photographs of secret meetings, and financial records that traced the flow of money through the corruption scheme. Among the materials was a letter Bobby had written but never sent, addressed to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. In it, he detailed his findings and expressed his fear that local law enforcement might be compromised. "If something happens to me," he had written, "look to the development project. They have too much to lose to let me expose what I found." The letter was dated just 5 days before his disappearance, suggesting he had sensed the danger closing in around him. Armed with this new evidence, Sarah finally had enough to request federal involvement in the case. The FBI's arrival in Millbrook sent shockwaves through the community, particularly among those who had something to hide. Within days, the investigation had expanded to include multiple federal agencies, and suddenly the obstacles Sarah had been facing began to crumble as the spotlight of national attention focused on their small town. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both more complex and more disturbing than Sarah had initially imagined. Bobby Mitchell had indeed uncovered a conspiracy involving the illegal acquisition of public land, but his disappearance had been orchestrated not by the primary beneficiaries of the scheme, but by someone closer to home, someone who had been feeding information to the conspirators and who realized that Bobby's investigation threatened to expose their own involvement. The arrest, when it came, shocked the community to its core. Deputy Chief Frank Morrison, Sarah's own supervisor and a man she had respected and trusted for years, was taken into custody as the primary suspect in Bobby's disappearance. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints on Bobby's cap, financial records showing payments from Millbrook Holdings to accounts he controlled, and most damning of all, security footage from a trail camera Bobby had secretly installed, showing Morrison and 2 other men confronting the veteran on the morning he disappeared. Morrison's confession, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper in the interrogation room, revealed the tragic details of what had happened. Bobby had confronted him about evidence he had found linking Morrison to the corruption scheme, threatening to expose not just the land deal, but Morrison's role in covering up other illegal activities. The confrontation had escalated, Morrison claimed, and in a moment of panic and rage, he had struck Bobby with a rock. The 2 men he had enlisted to help dispose of the body had panicked when Mika broke free and ran home, forcing them to hurriedly conceal Bobby's remains in a location that would take searchers months to discover. As Sarah sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the case files and preparing for the trials that would follow, she found herself thinking about Mika. The golden retriever had been Bobby's loyal companion, and in the end, she had also been his voice, her traumatized behavior and instinctive reactions providing the crucial clues that had led to the truth. It was a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the bonds between humans and their animal companions can transcend even death. The case of Bobby Mitchell's disappearance became a cautionary tale about corruption in small towns and the courage it takes to stand up to powerful interests. But for Sarah Thompson, it remained primarily a story about a man and his dog, about loyalty and loss, about the terrible price that good people sometimes pay for doing what's right. And somewhere in the misty forests of Oregon, the truth waited patiently to be discovered, just as Bobby Mitchell had always known it would be.